The clinking of ice against crystal was constant, a rhythmic high society heartbeat that echoed off the mahogany walls. The jazz was a given, a smooth, honey-thick sound that masked the darkness of the deals being made in the corner booths. That was the surface. But beneath the music, in the heavy air between breaths, was a cold, suffocating tension. It was the silence of the Black Dragon Syndicate, the kind of quiet that precedes a gunshot. I moved through it all like a ghost in a high-collar uniform. A black vest, polished shoes, and a name tag that felt more like a toe tag after a double shift. My name is Park Jaisu, and for the last 2 years, this velvet-lined tomb has been my entire world. I served top-shelf whiskey to men who smiled like saints while their hands stayed buried in their pockets, gripping cold steel. I was a professional shadow, trained to see everything and say nothing. I was invisible, and in this city, being invisible was the only way to stay alive. Tonight, however, the silence didn't just feel heavy, it felt lethal. It started the moment he walked in. The lounge didn't just go quiet, it seemed to lose its oxygen. The air turned sharp, ionized by the presence of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. Han Seung-wook, the wolf of Seoul. He moved with the immovable grace of a landslide, his charcoal suit cutting through the dim light like a blade. I watched from the bar as he took his seat, his chiseled jaw set in a mask of granite. I saw the way my manager, the shadow, lingered a second too long near Seung-wook's glass. I saw the subtle, frantic tremor in the manager's hand as he tilted a vial no larger than a teardrop. The toxin hit the whiskey with a faint, amber ripple. In that moment, my invisibility became a curse. I knew that if I stayed a ghost, a man would die. But if I stepped into the light, my life as I knew it would end. I didn't think, I just reached for a napkin. The scratch of the pen against the napkin felt like a scream in the quiet of the lounge. My hand was steady, but my heart was a trapped bird, battering against my ribs. Don't drink it, smile and leave now. I folded the small square of white linen, my movements mechanical. I had practiced the art of the invisible serve for 2 years, but tonight, every inch of my skin felt like it was on fire. I could feel the shadow, the manager watching from the corner of his eye, his nervous sweat a silent countdown. I stepped toward the center booth. The air grew colder the closer I got to Han Seung-wook. Up close, he was even more imposing. The scent of expensive tobacco and rain clung to his charcoal suit. Beside him, Kim Min-ho stood like a statue of granite, his eyes scanning the room with lethal efficiency. I didn't look at the boss. I didn't look at the poisoned whiskey. I simply leaned over to refresh the coasters. As I pulled my hand back, the note stayed. It sat there on the dark mahogany, a tiny white flag in a war zone. I waited for the sound of his chair scraping back. I waited for him to stand, to smile, to walk away into the night and leave me to my quiet, invisible life. But the silence didn't break. It deepened. I turned to walk away, my breath hitching in my throat, when a hand, large, warm, and terrifyingly strong, clamped around my wrist. The gold of his oversized watch glinted under the neon blue lights. The grip wasn't just a hold, it was an anchor. I felt the raw power in his fingers, the heavy-handed authority of a man who didn't take orders from anyone, especially not a waitress. I was forced to stop, my arm pulled taut. I looked down and my blood turned to ice. Seung-wook hadn't touched the drink. Instead, he was looking at the note, his eyes tracking the frantic lines of my handwriting. Then, slowly, he tilted his head back, his predatory gaze locking onto mine. "You have a very brave hand, Jaisu," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to vibrate through my own bones. "But you made one mistake." He didn't smile, he didn't leave. "You think that by saving my life, you get to keep yours." He pulled me an inch closer, his face inches from mine, the scent of danger now overwhelming. "In my world, little ghost, there are no good deeds, only debts, and you just sold yourself to the Black Dragon." Behind us, I heard the faint, metallic click of Minho's safety being disengaged. The trap hadn't just closed on the boss, it had swallowed me whole. The pressure on my wrist was absolute, a heavy, unyielding band of heat that anchored me to the spot while the rest of the world dissolved into a blur of neon and panic. Han Seung-wook didn't stand up. He rose like a shadow reclaiming the room. The gold watch on his wrist caught the flickering blue light of the bar, a silent testament to the wealth that bought this kind of terrifying stillness. "Walk," he commanded. It wasn't a request. I was pulled forward, my heels clicking erratically against the polished floor, a frantic contrast to his measured, predatory stride. As he led me toward the exit, the crowd parted with the same hushed reverence I'd seen 1,000 times, but tonight, I wasn't the ghost passing through them. I was the cargo. In the periphery of my vision, I saw the shadow. My manager, the man who had poured death into a glass, was leaning against the service station. His face was the color of curdled milk, a sheen of cold sweat making his skin glisten under the strobe lights. His eyes met mine for a fleeting, desperate second, vibrating with the fear of a man who realized his trap had caught the wrong prey. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He simply watched as the wolf he tried to kill walked away with the only person who could point a finger at him. We hit the cool night air of the alleyway, the scent of rain and exhaust replacing the cloying sandalwood of the lounge. A black sedan sat idling, its exhaust a rhythmic growl in the dark. Kim Min-ho was already there, holding the rear door open with the mechanical precision of a soldier. "Sir, the perimeter is," Min-ho began, but Seung-wook cut him off with a sharp tilt of his head. "The perimeter is compromised, Min-ho. We have a leak in the service staff," Seung-wook said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on my neck stand up. He finally turned to look at me, his grip on my wrist loosening just enough for his fingers to slide down and lace through mine, a terrifying parody of intimacy. "Wait," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding thin and alien in the open air. I gave you the note. I did my part. Let me go." Seung-wook's eyes, dark and unreadable as the Han River at midnight, bored into mine. He leaned in, his silhouette eclipsing the streetlights. "You saw a face, Jisoo. You saw a hand. In my world, that makes you a witness, and witnesses either belong to me or they belong to the earth." He didn't wait for my response. He maneuvered me into the back of the sedan. The leather cool and smelling of expensive skin. As the door thudded shut, sealing out the sounds of the city, I looked back through the tinted glass. The shadow was standing at the entrance of the alley, a small, receding figure in the dark, clutching his phone like a weapon. The dragon had taken me, but the snake was already dialing. The interior of the safe house was a study in cold, expensive geometry. Marble floors that didn't echo, glass walls that didn't break, and a silence so thick it made my ears ring. It was a palace built for a man who expected a war, and as the heavy steel doors hissed shut behind us, I realized I had traded my velvet-draped cage at the lounge for a tomb of polished granite. Han Seung-wook had disappeared into an inner sanctum the moment we arrived, leaving me in the expansive living area under the unblinking watch of Kim Min-ho. The bodyguard stood near the balcony, his silhouette a massive, immovable shadow against the glittering skyline of Seoul. He hadn't moved a muscle in 10 minutes, but I could feel his gaze, a heavy, clinical weight that dissected my every breath. "I need to go home," I said, my voice cracking the silence like a stone through ice. Min-ho didn't turn. "You don't have a home anymore, Park Jisoo. You have a location. And right now, this is the only one where you're still breathing." I stood up from the leather sofa, my legs trembling. I saved him. Why am I being treated like a prisoner? Finally, he turned. In the low light, his face was a mask of jagged scars and hardened resolve. He stepped into my space, his presence so massive it seemed to suck the air from the room. "The glass was spiked on your watch. In a room full of professionals, a waitress sees a microscopic vial and decides to be a hero. That isn't bravery. That's a scripted play." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous whisper. "Tell me who paid you to save him. Was it a setup to get you inside these walls, to act as the eyes for the next hit?" "I don't even know who he is," I shouted, the terror finally curdling into a desperate, raw defiance. "I saw a man about to die. I didn't see a syndicate boss or a wolf. I saw a human being, and I saw a coward, my manager, destroying a life for a handful of dirt. If I were part of the hit, I would have let him drink it." I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone and a crumpled receipt from my locker. Look at my life. I have $400 in savings and a cat that needs feeding. I'm not a spy. I'm just a girl who didn't want to watch a murder while she was clearing coasters. Minho's eyes searched mine, looking for the flicker of a lie. For a heartbeat, the air was static, charged with the threat of what he might do if he didn't believe me. Then, slowly, he straightened his suit jacket. The safety on his weapon didn't click back on, but the predatory edge in his posture softened by a fraction. "The boss will decide your fate," he said, turning back to the window. "But for your sake, I hope your memory is as sharp as your mouth, because tonight, you're the only map we have to the man who wants us dead." The door to the inner office slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, and Han Seung-wook stepped out. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were corded with steel. He didn't look like a man who had almost been assassinated. He looked like a predator who had just finished a meal. He sat across from me, his presence reclaiming the room's oxygen, and placed a sleek tablet on the marble table. "Memory is a fickle thing, Jaisu," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "Under pressure, it bends, but yours needs to be iron. Show me the room again." He swiped the screen, displaying a high-resolution grid of the Midnight Blues floor plan. I leaned in, my hands still shaking as I traced the familiar geography of my prison. I closed my eyes, letting the phantom scent of sandalwood and expensive gin fill my mind. I saw the VIP booths, the glint of the crystal, and the shifting shadows of the staff. "The manager, the shadow, he was nervous," I whispered, my finger hovering over the service station. "He wasn't just checking the drink, he kept looking at the corner booth, table 4. Seung-wook's eyes sharpened. Table 4 is a blind spot for the primary cameras, who was sitting there. A regular, we called him the architect. He never drinks, just orders sparkling water and watches the floor. I moved my finger across the digital map, tracing the line of sight. He didn't speak to the manager tonight, not once. But every time the manager moved toward your table, he would adjust his cufflinks. Left, then right. It was a rhythm, a signal. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Seung-wook. The manager is a coward. He doesn't have the stomach for a coup. He was a puppet on a string, and the strings were being pulled from table 4. The architect wasn't watching you, boss. He was watching the clock. He knew exactly when the glass would reach you. The silence that followed was heavy, the air vibrating with the silent communication between Seung-wook and Minho. The bodyguard's hand twitched toward his holster, his face a mask of cold realization. "The architect," Seung-wook mused, his thumb tracing the edge of his jaw. "A man who builds things only to watch them fall." He looked at me, a flicker of something that wasn't quite respect, but was no longer suspicion, gleaming in his dark eyes. "You have a gift for seeing the rot beneath the surface, Jaisu. Most people look at the stage. You look at the rafters." He stood up, the movement fluid and dangerous. "Minho, pull the secondary feed from the service elevator. I want a name for our architect. And Jaisu," he paused, his gaze pinning me to the chair. "Don't get too comfortable. Seeing the truth is a dangerous burden. Now that you've pointed him out, he'll be looking for you too." The hum of the safe house's server room was suddenly swallowed by a sound that didn't belong in a palace of glass. The dull, muffled thwip of a silenced round, shattering the balcony door. "Down!" Minho roared, his massive frame moving with a speed that defied his size. He tackled me toward the floor just as a second swarm of glass rained down like diamonds in the dark. Seung-wook didn't flinch. He stayed low, his hand already gripping a sleek black pistol he'd pulled from beneath the marble table. The air, once stagnant and cold, was now electric with the scent of ozone and gunpowder. Through the jagged remains of the window, I saw them, 4 figures in tactical gear, fast-roping from the roof above. The architect hadn't just been watching the clock, he'd been synchronizing the end of the world. "The main elevator is dead," Minho shouted over the rhythmic pop of return fire. "They've looped the security feed. They're coming up the fire stairs." Seung-wook looked at me, his eyes 2 burning coals in the shadows. This was the moment I was supposed to be a witness, a piece of cargo to be discarded. But I saw the floor plan in my head, not as a blueprint, but as a map of the service routes I'd memorized during my years as an invisible worker. "The laundry chute," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper against the chaos. "In the kitchen. It's a direct drop to the industrial bins in the basement. It bypasses the fire stairs and the lobby cameras." Seung-Wook's gaze narrowed. "Min-ho, cover the kitchen door." We moved as a single, panicked unit. The kitchen was a graveyard of stainless steel and shadows. Min-ho laid down a heavy suppressive fire, the brass casings clattering on the tile like hail. I scrambled toward the back wall, ripping open the heavy steel hatch of the service chute. It was dark, narrow, and smelled of chemical detergent, a vertical tunnel to the unknown. "It leads to the loading dock," I said, looking up at Seung-Wook. "The trucks leave at 4:00 a.m. If we move now, we can be out before they breach the hall." For a heartbeat, the wolf of soul looked at the narrow opening, then at me. There was no time for suspicion. He shoved his weapon into his waistband and grabbed my hand, his grip even tighter than it had been at the bar. "Go," he commanded. I slid into the darkness first, the metal walls scraping my skin, followed by the heavy weight of the men who ruled the city. As we plummeted toward the basement, the muffled explosions from the penthouse echoed above us, a dying roar of a cage that could no longer hold its prey. We weren't ghosts anymore. We were the hunters in the walls. The basement of the industrial laundry facility smelled of bleach and damp concrete, a sterile tomb far removed from the neon warmth of the midnight blue. We had emerged from the loading docks like rats from a sinking ship, but the roles had shifted. We were no longer fleeing. We were hunting. In the center of the damp room, illuminated by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb, sat the shadow. My manager, the man who had loomed over my daily life with petty authority, was now stripped of his vest and his dignity. He was zip-tied to a rusted folding chair, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The architect had abandoned him, and now he was alone with the wolf. Seung-Wook didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic calm, circling the chair like a predator deciding where to take the first bite. He reached out and adjusted the manager's collar, a gesture that mirrored the architect's cufflink signal from the bar. The irony was a blade, and Seung-Wook was twisting it. "I want to know how much a life is worth to you," Seung-Wook whispered, leaning in until their foreheads almost touched. "Was it a debt, a woman, or do you just enjoy the taste of copper in your mouth?" "I had no choice," the manager blubbered, the sound echoing pathetically against the concrete. "They said they'd kill my sister, the architect. He has people everywhere." Seung-Wook didn't respond with words. He reached for a heavy industrial wrench on a nearby workbench. I flinched, my stomach churning. I had wanted justice, but the cold, clinical violence unfolding before me was a different animal entirely. This wasn't the invisibility I was used to. This was the raw, jagged marrow of the world I had accidentally stepped into. "Jai-Su," Seung-Wook said, his voice cutting through the manager's whimpering. He didn't look back at me. "Tell me, did he look this afraid when he dropped the toxin into my glass?" I looked at the manager, the man who had nearly ended my life along with the boss's. My moral compass, once so clear, was spinning wildly. He looked like he was waiting for a paycheck," I managed to say, my voice trembling. Seung-Wook nodded slowly. He didn't strike. Instead, he placed the heavy metal tool against the manager's kneecap, applying just enough pressure to make the man scream before the blow even landed. "The architect didn't hire a soldier," Seung-Wook said, his eyes finally finding mine. They were voids of absolute, frozen intent. "He hired a mirror, and now I'm going to break it." As the first blow fell, I didn't turn away. I couldn't. The invisible girl was dead, and the woman standing in the damp dark was learning that in the world of the Black Dragon, mercy was just another word for weakness. The shadow began to talk, the names of the co-conspirators spilling out of him like blood, and I realized that once the screaming stopped, there would be no going back to the lounge. I was part of the storm now. The industrial basement was still ringing with the manager's final, broken pleas when Min-ho hauled him away. The silence that rushed back in was cold and tasted of copper. Han Seung-wook stood by the workbench, wiping a smear of grease from his hand with a white silk handkerchief. He looked perfectly composed, as if he hadn't just dismantled a man's spirit. The money didn't come from a suitcase, Seung-wook said, his voice level and dark. A man like the architect doesn't leave a trail of cash. He moves through the cracks. He gestured to the laptop salvaged from the manager's office. I sat before it, my fingers still humming with residual adrenaline. I didn't see the screen as a tool of business. I saw it as the digital back alley of the midnight blue. For 2 years, I had watched the inventory counts fluctuate, bottles of 30-year-old cognac that never left the shelf, cases of champagne that were scanned in but never opened. It was the background noise of the lounge, a minor graft I had ignored to stay invisible. "He used the liquor manifest," I whispered, my eyes scanning the rows of code and logistics. "Look at the Golden Crane shipments. We haven't served that brand in 6 months, but the inventory shows a massive intake every Friday at 1:00 a.m. I bypassed the surface-level ledger, digging into the hidden metadata of the warehouse receipts. There, buried under the guise of an import tax, was a series of encrypted outgoing transfers. I traced the routing numbers, my heart skipping as the destination revealed itself. "It's not just a payout," I said, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my wide eyes. "It's a recurring tribute. The money is flowing to the White Tiger clan." Seung-wook leaned over my shoulder, his presence a heavy, warm weight in the cold room. His eyes narrowed as he read the figures. The White Tigers were the Black Dragon's oldest rivals, a sleeping beast everyone thought had been tamed years ago. "They didn't just buy a manager," Seung-wook growled, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "They bought the foundation of the house. They've been subsidizing the lounge's losses for months to create this blind spot." He looked at me, and for the first time, the wolf looked truly dangerous, not because of the violence he could inflict, but because of the intelligence he had just weaponized. I wasn't just a witness anymore, I was the key to his kingdom. "You found the thread, Jaisu," he said, his hand momentarily resting on the back of my chair, a gesture of possession that chilled me to the bone. "Now, we're going to pull it until their entire world unravels." The digital blue light of the ledger faded as Han Seung-wook closed the laptop, leaving us in a dimness punctuated only by the distant hum of the industrial laundry. The air between us had shifted. I was no longer just a witness he had to babysit or a liability to be managed. I was the person who had found the blade aimed at his throat. He stood and walked toward a heavy, reinforced case near the workbench. For a moment, he simply stared at it, his reflection caught in the polished black surface. "Most people in my world are born into the fire, Jaisu," he said, his voice unusually quiet, lacking its usual jagged edge. "They are trained to see enemies, but you were a ghost by choice. You saw the poison not because you were looking for it, but because you actually give a damn about the life of a stranger." He opened the case and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. When he turned back to me, the harsh fluorescent light above us caught the sharp, brilliant glint of gold. He didn't hand it to me. He took my hand, his touch firm but devoid of the bruising grip he'd used at the lounge. He slid a ring onto my right index finger. It was a heavy band of rose gold, fashioned into the subtle, coiled scales of a dragon, with a single black diamond set into the center like a watchful eye. It was beautiful, but it felt heavy, a physical weight that tethered me to him more effectively than any zip tie. "In the Black Dragon, we don't give medals for bravery," he whispered, his thumb grazing my knuckle. "We give symbols of belonging. This ring tells my men and my enemies that you are under my shadow. It tells them that if they touch you, they are touching me." I looked down at the gold. It felt like a brand. "I didn't do it to belong to you," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted. "I know," he replied, a shadow of a smile ghosting his lips, the first I had seen. "That's why you're still alive. But the invisible girl died the moment she wrote that note. You can't go back to clearing glasses, Jaisu. You've seen the architect's face, and he has seen yours." He let go of my hand, but the warmth of his skin lingered. "Tonight, you aren't a waitress. You are my consultant, And tomorrow, we walk into the white tiger's den to show them exactly what happens when they try to poison a king. I closed my fist, the dragon's scales digging into my skin. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but beneath it was something new, a spark of lethal purpose. I wasn't just watching the storm anymore. I was the one holding the lightning. The transformation was more than fabric and thread. It was a total erasure of the girl who had spent years hiding in the kitchen's steam. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the safe house, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The black silk gown clung to my frame like a second skin, its plunging neckline and structured shoulders projecting a cold, architectural elegance. My hair, once pulled back in a fraying ponytail, was now gathered into a sleek, razor-sharp bun. The dragon ring on my finger felt like the final piece of armor, its black diamond eye catching the light with every breath I took. "You look like a weapon," a voice rumbled behind me. I turned to see Han Seung-wook. He was dressed in a midnight blue tuxedo, his presence so commanding it seemed to pull the very walls inward. He walked toward me, his gaze traveling over the transformation he had orchestrated. He reached out, his fingers lingering on the silk at my shoulder. "Tonight, you are not Park Jae-soo, the waitress," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "You are my lead logistics consultant. You are the only person in the room who truly understands the flow of the Golden Crane shipments. When the board members look at you, they must see someone who can dismantle their bank accounts with a single keystroke." "And if they ask why they've never seen me before?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell them the truth," he said, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes. "Tell them I keep my most valuable assets in the dark until it's time to strike." We arrived at the syndicate's headquarters, a glass monolith that pierced the Seoul skyline like a needle. Kim Min-ho led the way, his hand never straying far from the concealed holster beneath his jacket. As we entered the boardroom, the silence from the lounge returned, but this time it was weaponized. 12 men sat around a table of obsidian glass, their faces masks of old-world power and new-world greed. At the far end sat the architect. He looked exactly as I remembered, composed, silver-haired, and radiating an aura of calculated indifference. He didn't look at Seung-wook, he looked at me. His eyes narrowed, searching for the crack in my couture, the tremor in my hands that would give away the ghost beneath the silk. I didn't blink. I took my seat at Seung-wook's right hand, the dragon ring clicking softly against the obsidian table. It was the same sound a trigger makes just before the hammer falls. I looked at the architect and allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. For the first time in my life, I wasn't watching the stage from the rafters. I was the one directing the play. The tension in the boardroom was a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. Han Seung-wook sat at the head of the obsidian table, his hands folded with a terrifying, calm symmetry. He didn't speak. He simply let the silence do the work of a blade. I stood slightly behind him, the light of the chandelier catching the dragon ring on my finger, a beacon for every nervous eye in the room. "There is a discrepancy in the Golden Crane accounts," Seung-wook said, his voice a low, melodic threat that made the air turn cold. "My consultant has spent the morning tracing a thread that leads away from our coffers and into the hands of the White Tiger clan." He gestured to me. I stepped forward, my silk gown rustling like a warning. I didn't look at the data projected on the wall. I looked at their faces. I was no longer a waitress watching from the rafters. I was a predator reading the pulse. "The inventory doesn't lie," I said, my voice steady and sharp as a glass shard. "But men do. They lie with their hands. They lie with their eyes." I walked slowly around the table, the heels of my shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown. I stopped behind a man named Elder Kang, a senior advisor whose loyalty was supposed to be ironclad. I saw his thumb twitch against the obsidian, a rhythmic, frantic tapping. Then I moved to the architect. He remained a statue, but the vein in his temple was a drumbeat of panic. "The signals are different now," I whispered, leaning down near the architect's ear, mirroring the intimacy of the note I had slid across the bar. "No cufflinks to adjust, no bourbon to spike, just the silence of a man who knows the wolf is at his throat." I looked up and caught Seungwook's gaze. I gave a single, definitive nod toward the architect and Elder Kang. The explosion of movement was instantaneous. Kim Min-ho didn't need a command. He was a blur of black suit and lethal intent. Before the architect could even reach for the burner phone in his pocket, Min-ho's hand was around his throat, pinning him to the glass table. The rest of the board froze, their faces drained of color as the realization of Seungwook's absolute power crashed down on them. Seungwook stood up, the movement fluid and final. He walked to the architect, looking down at the man who had tried to erase him. He didn't strike, he simply reclaimed the room. "The girl you overlooked saw everything," Seungwook said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence. "And now she is the last thing you will ever see." He turned to me, his dark eyes softening by a fraction of a degree, a silent acknowledgement of the debt now paid. The invisible Waitress was gone. In her place stood the dragon's shadow, and as the traitors were dragged into the darkness of the hall, I realized I hadn't just survived the storm. I had become the one who commanded it.